I'm Jeff Gordon, Columbia. I'm visiting at Oxford. The assumption seemed to be that firms were steady state, that firms would always remain up running, and so long as the shareholders received a financial rate of return, I'm quoting, then essentially the rest of enterprise earnings were available to take account of the stakeholders, which is, first of all, it's a view that had currency in the United States in the 1930s. It's really an early view of Adolf Berle, to my way of thinking, I think from an American perspective, the issue would be this doesn't take account of growth. It doesn't take account of risk. And so the relevant text to consider is not the Friedman text, but rather the Schumpeter text, the idea of creative destruction, not in the sense of the goal of warning monopoly replacing monopoly, but rather in the sense that dynamism means that firms take risks, that firms will fail, that incentives for growth are really important, that growth leads to improvement in the welfare of everybody in the society. My own work focuses on the adjustment costs of economic change, which I don't think can be internalized at the firm level. Firms can't write an insurance policy against layoffs, against a disruptive move in the real economy. So that requires a certain relationship between the firm and the government, which I think has to be spelled out and made clear, and that's part of what my work is about. But in Europe, even though the safety net is so much broader and deeper, the sense that firms have a special role here is, again, to an American ear, sounds it's a different set of themes. As I think about the ESG debate, it's basically incoherent, right? Most of it is marketing fraud. That's what the SEC has determined. That's why they're putting out rules as to how to label ESG financial funds. But it's not just that there's greenwashing going on. It's how do you, ESG has 10, 15, 20 different things in it. How do you weight them? We can't risk weight assets on a bank balance sheet in a consistent way. How are we going to risk weight or weight the various elements that go into ESG for all the investors who may care about different pieces of them? So the idea that there's a single index of them that adds up the different components in a useful way, I don't think that's a valid way to think about the many serious issues that we face. Particularly, it's not a useful way to think about climate change. And the environmental issue of climate change is a capitalized E. It's a boldface E. It's an existential E. And so the field, I think, is kind of undergoing tension between those who have a whole package of ESG goals in mind and some others who've newly come to this concern, and I would include myself among them, precisely because they think that the climate change issue is a systematic issue, a systematic risk issue in a way that is quite different from these other elements of ESG, which may be socially important, but the life of the planet doesn't depend upon a resolution of them. Climate change necessarily involves not only governments but also firms, whereas many of the social and environmental issues even, which fly under the ESG flag, I think are first order responsibilities of government. And to ask firms to take on the burden of them is perhaps not the best way to go. NASDAQ, for example, has, but it's on a complier explain standard, the female diversity on boards, which I think is going to be a solvable issue in a very short-term period. You know, But other elements of diversity and equity and inclusion in employment throughout the firms are obviously much tougher issues, and they are not governance issues in a narrow sense. They're really how large economic organizations assimilate the diversity of citizens in the United States and the role that they have in mainstreaming them and giving them the opportunities that would be good for all citizens to have. But the SEC has not played, I don't think, a really leadership role in pushing that, in part because it's hard for them to do it within the mandate that they have, which is mostly disclosure. Yeah, climate change will require the reorganization of the economy. So I had a discussion with Stephen Barry, who's on my panel, about the role that the Church of England is playing in the stewardship role it's playing on the climate change issue. And I was telling him this is the activist role that they are playing, in fact, the catalytic role that they're playing, is because to address the climate change issue requires a reorganization of the real economy. That is a kind of an issue completely different from anything else in the ESG bucket. And it's, you know, it precisely because it's so deep and thoroughgoing, it requires, I think, a rethink that doesn't limit itself to the categories of ESG, but may require us to think about governance and the interaction between firms and government in a different way than we have before. But I do think the conventional ESG analysis is too limited because of the impact of the climate change threat. Well, there's obviously a lot of transition planning for net zero by, 2040, 2050, who knows when. But to give you an example of some of the rethink that ought to occur, so much effort has been spent on the public fossil fuels firms, which, from my perspective, has kind of missed the main point, which is to say that if demand didn't exist for oil and gas, then these firms would play a much less important economic role in the first place. So the first target ought to be Volkswagen and GM and Ford and whoever else to push their conversion from internal combustion engines to electrical ones. But also, secondly, the fossil fuel firms, if we were to close down the public firms, the state-owned firms are fully able to pump the additional oil that would be on demand. So it's not clear what you've achieved if you get Shell to stop pushing out oil, right? Saudi Aramco just has another market so long as the demand is there. And then secondly, some of the specific things that have been pushed on fossil fuel firms to become greener have actually been counterproductive. And so that's my point. There has to be a completely different kind of thinking that takes, that's really serious about the threat of climate change and also the rather broad changes in the real economy, the transitions in the real economy that must be pursued if any of these goals are going to be achieved in a time that will avoid damage to the planet.